what is diversity, equity, inclusion, or inclusion and equity to me? And then how do you bring a company to the point where it's embracing the concept of that? So diversity, equity, diversity, inclusion, and equity, and people put it in different orders. So diversity, inclusion, and equity, to me, is it's kind of three different things. The first one is it's about really representing all groups inside your company, so that you look and feel the part of the world we live in. And so, in other words, in so many places, there are many underrepresented groups that are underrepresented inside of organizations, and we pay for that. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. Inclusion is about making sure that, it's great to get people in the door, but it doesn't work if they don't feel like they belong there. And I think a lot of companies probably still are doing, but certainly in the early days of this discussion about diversity, inclusion, and equity, we're managing to hire great underrepresented people, but not managing to keep them for too long because they didn't feel like they're part of the game. So how do you create a culture where that isn't true? And then the third one is equity, and I think equity in many ways is the least discussed and maybe even most important one, because it's the ledger. How do I know when we've gotten to the point where it's where it ought to be? And I think it's not until it's not until it's really equal. Well, everybody has a fair shot, but they don't. And because of the systemic biases, prejudices, racism that are built into so much of where we are, you can't get to equal without some way of addressing equity, which means making up for lost time, making up for lost resources, making up for lost lives and opportunities. So I think, to me, diversity, inclusion, and equity is just getting to the starting line that we should have always had. How do you do that inside a company that's a function of this world that we live in, and has probably perpetuated many of the disadvantages that has almost certainly perpetuated many of the disadvantages that culture created, depending on where you are in the world. It's a daunting idea. How do we get to that starting line that's fair? But I think it starts with the top. If you don't believe it as a leader and you don't live it and talk about it, we're not going to get there, of course. And I think the real starting point for getting an organization moving in that direction, and I hope every company will do this, is to redefine the company purpose. Every company's different. Every company's purpose is unique to them. But every company can build diversity, equity, and inclusion into their purpose. And I'll give you an example of how we did. So we took our purpose was enabling people to fulfill their passion. Whether it's customers or employees or whatever. We added the word "all" after George Floyd, enabling all people to fulfill their passions. The "all" part is easy to talk about. Why all? And it's because we want all people, including those who've been left out of the equation, inside our company and outside our company. So that means if you believe that, if you have conviction around that purpose, means we have to do this for all people, even those who had the biggest disadvantage to getting there, to fulfilling their passions. A person with disability. How did they fulfill their passions? What are we doing to enable that? And the answer is not much. And it was not much. Now we're doing a lot more. We'll be doing more and more. But it's true for every underrepresented group. So it starts with your purpose, and then it goes down through the company. And I think you also can't get there if you don't know where you're going. So you need goals, and the end game goal is great, but you got to have intermediate goals. So for example, this year, every one of my leadership team members has specific DE&I goals, and they'll be paid based on them because we have specific targets for them. But the biggest target we have is the one that I can judgmentally use as to take them up or down. And that is going to be completely based on diversity, equity, and inclusion performance. I don't have it pegged to that specific number. That will be a judgment call based on the difficulty of the dive and the amount of effort put in. And this time I will reward effort. But in the end, without effort, you won't get outcome. So that's the second thing that I'm doing, is really building into my leadership team's goals. The third one's training. You know, training is like the default for everything, but I would say one of the biggest problems we have around the world is just people's understanding of each other, of what it's like to be in an underrepresented group if you're not in one, what it's like to be in another one if you're whatever underrepresented group you might be in, and then what you can do about it. How you can interrupt things that shouldn't be happening, and microaggressions and biases and systemic prejudices. Recognizing them when you see them, and then figuring out what to do about them. So training is a huge part of that. And then the last thing I'd mention is maybe in some ways the one that really touches everything, which is having responsibility, feeling a sense of responsibility because it's in the purpose and because people are starting to understand it, to touch every element that you can of your value creation process. So I have my head of people and culture, my CHRO, Chief Human Resources Officer. I hate the word human resources, but she is responsible for diversity, equity, inclusion directly. I'm the number one responsible, and she's, for me, my point person. But she owns it from our supplier. So we'll be setting standards for those suppliers and expecting of them. And then we'll be expecting them to set standards for their suppliers over time. And then we'll expect our suppliers to be diverse. So we have a supplier diversity program that's very aggressive, including developing new suppliers. And there's a whole battery of understanding of that to do. And then going into the company, of course, there's all the hiring practices and promotion and fair pay and equal pay and all those things, all the way into our customers and making sure we're developing products for underrepresented groups, which we are now. So being very explicit about that, making sure we're really doing it. And then, out in the communities where we operate, but more importantly, bumping into and affecting other companies by setting higher standards, by challenging them publicly or inviting them into initiatives, and then up to the board. So she has responsibility for that, and I have responsibility for that end to end to end to end. And I think you need specific plans across all those things.